Hey y'all, I'm Tyler, and this is Outbound Sales Lift, where you can elevate your SDR team and transform your sales development efforts. Thanks so much for listening today. This is our first live broadcast of the show. And if you're listening on a podcast player, please consider dropping us a rating. Really helps us get found, and so others can find this show just like you did today. So on today's episode, we're going to be covering how to increase your positive outbound replies by 236%. And I have the pleasure of being joined by Mr. Collin Mitchell. Collin, how's it going?
Man, I am glad to be here. I know we're going to have fun. I love this topic. And yeah, to be the first live episode, I feel so privileged.
We'll do it live. We'll do it live, baby. So, Collin is the chief evangelist at Humantic AI. And like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about how to really increase those positive outbound replies that you're getting. So, Collin, 236%. That seems, I mean, that's a crazy number. How do you increase by that percentage? And how do you get really these positive replies coming in with your outbound?
Yeah, I mean, outbound, as you know, Tyler, is getting harder, right? For a lot of sales orgs, there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of people that are having a hard time even just getting in the inbox, right? And there's a few things that we've seen that can really make a big difference in a few different ways and 236 is average. We've seen even higher. Like we just ran a pilot where a team had almost, a 300% lift in positive replies based on one simple thing: personalizing the message based on the person, right?
Mm,
So most people have sort of a baseline sequence that they're running, which is really typically based more on a persona, right? This is our ICP. Maybe here's their size, here's the problems that we think that they maybe have. All of that stuff is valuable, but what isn't taken into consideration is the variations of different people that are recipients of that message. And that's where you can really see a big lift, is when you personalize to the person. And so what I mean is, like, what does that particular person care about most? What are their communication styles and preferences? And what things should you avoid mentioning that are sort of like hot buttons or landmines or traps to avoid? So when you take all those things into consideration, you can personalize, and you can do this at scale to the person rather than just sending your sort of baseline templated sequence that's all written based on persona.
gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like you think when we say personalization, when you're just personalizing to the persona, which I guess is a little bit more broad, that's not even really personalization, it sounds like you
No.
think. Yeah.
Well, people are viewing personalization as like, hey, you went to this school. Hey,
Yep.
really enjoyed this LinkedIn post. Really enjoyed seeing you on, the podcast with Tyler. Those are, shows that you like did some work to research that person before
Mhm.
sending them a message, so that it doesn't necessarily feel like you just got jammed into a sequence and put on a
Yeah.
list and clicked go. So those help a little bit, but what isn't taken into consideration is, like, is this a person that cares more about relationships? Is this a person that cares more about impact or ROI? So taking into consideration the things that matter most to these people and embedding that into the language and how you present, your small value prop or your, message there in the context to get some intrigue from
Mhm.
the recipient.
So let's talk a little bit then, like, let's get granular. What do you see working then? Like, if we're going to go specific, we're going to go to the person. We're not going to the persona. We're going specific to the person. The things that you mentioned. Hey, you went to school here. Hey, I saw you on this. Hey, I saw this online about your company. Those are the things that come to mind, right? When a lot of people think personalization, it sounds like you think those and other things, or like, what are you seeing when you get granular as to like what type of personalization is working, what is not? How do you get 236% lift? Because that seems astronomical, right? So what's the secret sauce there?
Yeah. So the secret sauce is knowing your prospects and knowing what their personality type is, right? And knowing there's certain things like what your subject line should be based on their personality. What the, should you say hi? Should you say hey? Should you put first name only? Right? These are all small details that a lot of people think are meaningless. But the problem is sellers are writing messages the way that they would respond to a message if they were
Mm,
receiving it.
mm,
And the issue is that only works if you're sending a message to somebody that just maybe happens to have the same personality type as you.
yep.
An example that I like to use a lot because I think it's one that makes a lot of people laugh is bullet points. A lot of times people love bullet points, but there's a good percentage of people that also hate them and it drives them nuts. And so I know
Really?
we're talking about top of funnel, but let's just say let's like think let's say you have already a prospect engaged, right? And
Hmm.
and you send them a message recap after discovery, right? You send bullet points because that's how you love receiving information and they're a type that you shouldn't do that to. Well, that's enough to stall your deal. That's enough to even kill your deal because if it sits in their inbox for 2 weeks, what do you think is going to happen?
Mm,
Right? So
yeah.
that's an example that I like to use, but also just knowing, are they a dominant person, right? If they're a dominant or a person, that means that they're very goal oriented,
Hmm.
and you need to show them, how what it is that you do can align with the goals that you know that they have. And also, relationships don't matter as much to them. Not that they don't matter; it's just not high on the list for them in priority when they're making business decisions. Now, there's other people where it's the exact opposite. Small talk, rapport building, showing that you know what school they go to, things pleasant, small pleasantries go a long way because they value that stuff. So knowing this information about the people that you're sending it to matters a lot. And that's how you can see these significant lifts in positive replies when you know this information before you hit go on that sequence.
Gotcha. I want to go back and double click on the bullet points because I'm clearly a bullet point guy. And
I
now I
love it.
want to know why. So you've connected bullet points in messaging to personality type. And you're saying some folks love that, others don't like it at all. I guess I want to know more. Who does like bullet points? What personality types like it? What don't? And I'd love to just dig into that a bit deeper.
There's a few different types of people, right? There's people where it's like bullet points are going to be a winning way to communicate. And then there's going to be people where you really should avoid them.
Mm,
And so when we're talking about personality, right, it's not so black and white, right? There's between the models that we use at Humantic, there's 36 different possible variations of personality, right? So some people are going to be a hard yes, you should use them. Others are going to be like avoid them at all costs.
mm.
And then there's going to be some in between where it's like, hey, you could use it, but it's not necessarily like a recommended winning way to communicate with those people.
I see. Okay. So it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule because we have so many. 36 is a lot. And I'm assuming some people are just very pro, some very against, some in the middle. And is that, it sounds like when you also mentioned like hi or first name or hey, also kind of would that personality would type would indicate whether or not which one of those you should use as well?
Yeah. And also like length of message, right? For example, C type people are very detail oriented, right? So your messaging should be much more proper, much more, buttoned up. You see a lot of people writing messages without proper grammar, right? Which in a lot of cases work fine because people can process it that way. The same way that you see sort of like LinkedIn post formatting and stuff like that, right? But if you
Yeah.
send a message like that to the wrong person, they're going to think, what the heck is wrong with you? And they're never going to reply. So
Even as
knowing,
simple as just the intro, like that could throw it off, or the subject line, the wrong intro, using bullets or not, like you decrease your reply rate substantially to the wrong person. Maybe you never get a reply because of those little minor details.
or being too vague, right? Which is
Mm,
very common, right? Because specifically in top of funnel, people are just trying to create some intrigue or some interest, right? And so
mhm.
sometimes the language that they use is a little bit mysterious to, and motivate people to want to learn more or tell me more about that, right? I mean, at least people that are doing outbound right are trying to create intrigue. They're not, asking for time as their call to action. They're not sending a calendar link in the message. And again, this does happen. I'm talking about people that are even just doing well with outbound today, right? They're
Hmm.
not doing these things. In a lot of cases, the way that that messaging comes across is very vague.
Hmm.
And with the wrong type of person, that's going to turn them off completely.
Hmm. Yep, exactly. Well, I like that you think about creating intrigue, and you bring up a good point there. You talk about CTAs too. Like, do different personality types lend themselves? Like, should I use the meeting link with X personality type because I'm the type of person that just wants to be able to book through the meeting link. Other people, if you do a direct CTA like that, that's going to really turn me off. Does it carry on to the CTA? Is it really like every single piece of the email the personality type would indicate yes, no, or maybe?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we can break it down. And one thing is, yes, there's some people where you really need to formally state your ask, like be very direct,
Hmm.
right? And that's what's going to win them over. But we get into a lot of nitty gritty details, all the way from subject line to salutation. So skip hi or hey with some people, or skipping greetings, right? Some people like greetings, like hey, hope everything's going well, like
Yep.
which is a line that a lot of people hate and say never use, but with some people it's actually recommended. Now, also another big one is emojis and gifs, right? A lot of people are trying to bring creativity into their messaging, and some people that are a little bit more informal
Hmm.
are going to appreciate that, right? But others, we would say that you recommend it, or we would say you avoid it completely.
Hmm.
Okay, and then we talked about bullet points a little bit, but then like that closing line, that CTA, which is kind of what you asked, we'll even give you like specific things that we can recommend. Like, should you formally state your ask? Yes. Okay, so you might want to try something like, hey, if you're available tomorrow, could we discuss this? Or
Hmm.
would you be open to chat, learning more about this sometime next week? So really formally stating your ask with certain types of people is highly recommended. Also tone, right? What should the tone of your words?
Hmm.
Do you need to come across confident or not? What your overall messaging should be focused on, right? With some people, it needs to be more on output driven. On other types of people, it needs to be more like relationship focused, because that's something that really matters to them a lot. A lot of sellers are taught that like rapport building and relationships, and there's people that sit on different sides of the fence of like, we've got the people who think relationships matter and it's the
Yep.
most important thing. And then we've got people that sit on the side of the fence where it's like, no, relationships don't matter. If you solve a problem and there's value, like they don't need to be friends with you. Who cares, right? I'm sure I don't know what side of the fence you sit on, Tyler, but the answer is they're both wrong because it matters on who the person is. Doesn't
Right.
matter.
It depends on the personality type, right? Which
Exactly.
it sounds like, okay, there's all these personality types. Obviously, Humantic, the tool, like has some way of figuring out I'm personality type 32 and your personality type 8. But how does that even happen? Like how do you know what personality type I am?
Yeah. I mean, do you want me to tell you?
I mean, yeah, I'd like to know like what's the way in which you
Yeah.
determine which one of these I am? Is it just based on my LinkedIn
So,
profile or what does it look like?
yeah, yeah. So we scan the digital footprint in like 30 seconds or less and identify personality. And so for you specifically, Tyler, you're a DS type, right? And so
DS.
yeah,
Okay.
and so the reason, and there's not a lot of people that do this type of, have this sort of technology available. There's one other company that does it, and they follow Disk only. We use Disk and Ocean, which are also referred to as the Big Five, and so
Disc
that's why.
and ocean.
And Ocean, yeah.
Okay.
And so they're also, commonly referred to as the Big Five, right? So that's how we can get really, really granular and accurate by using both of those personality models.
Okay.
And so for you specifically, you're a DS, right? So that
Okay.
means and if you're following DISC, like there's four quadrants,
Yes.
D, I, S, and C. And
What are those for? Just to let the audience know, what are the four stand for in disc?
Yeah, so D is like a dominant type, I
Yep.
is influencer, S is steady, and then C is a calculative type.
Got it.
Okay. And then there's all variations, right? You could be D, S, you could be,
Historically, I
DI,
think
and
when
so
I've
on.
taken it, I've been like DI, kind of like straddling the line between D and I. Yeah.
Yeah. And the test, people that have taken the test, sometimes those can be a little bit tricky and the results can vary because you're bringing your own bias into answering those questions,
You're
right?
answering the question like you're like what you want to be perceived as, maybe not the
Exactly.
actual truth. I've
Exactly.
always
Yeah.
thought that when you're taking those personality tests, like,
I
is
mean,
this really what I am? Or I don't know.
they
I'm kind
try
of
to
like,
yeah, they try to ask you, like things in different ways and,
yeah,
instead of like, hey, am I still getting the same answer with this question? And some of them can even feel a little bit tricky, right?
yeah. Oh, it
Um,
does. I feel like you always get caught in the middle. Well, maybe I'm that, but maybe I'm that. I don't know.
yeah. And then if you don't like the results, you take it again, right?
Oh yeah, I don't want to be a D. I'm an I. I'll take this thing until I make it. I'm done. I'm an I. So
Yeah. And now, if you like, let's say you sell into a particular title of people, right? Like, let's say you sell SaaS and you sell sales software into
Mhm.
sales leaders. You're going to see a lot of consistency around the types that you see. Lots of sales leaders are high D types, and they
Yep.
could be. But then it gets more granular. They can be a DI, they can be a DS, and then sometimes you even get an oddball in there that's something that you're like, really, don't see a
Is that
lot of that.
possible?
Yeah, yeah, it is. And these, we're talking mostly about outbound messaging, but I've even seen this stuff work really well, even like cold calling and prospecting. So, we see teams, basically bucket their leads based on personality. And
That's
we've
so
even
cool.
we've
Yeah.
ran some tests ourselves as well, where you're not necessarily changing the call script as much because that can be a little bit overwhelming. But, the goal of a cold call is to get into a conversation. And so
Mhm.
once you get into a conversation with somebody based on whatever your script is and stuff like that, the how you frame that conversation, the tone of in which you get into that conversation can be different
Yep.
based on the person's personality.
100%. So you mentioned DS. The S stands for something else, right? We went through the DISC scale. The S is that ocean scale. There's a
Yeah.
second layer to this that gets it more granular almost.
Yeah, so it actually rates you, out of 1 out of 10 in each quadrant,
Okay.
right? And then your personality is going to be a variation of the two quadrants that you score the highest on, right? So, but then there's other factors taken in there, like you could score, you know, high on two, and then the third one could be, fairly high but not as high. So there's a lot, without getting too deep into the weeds, about how this stuff works. The recommendations are based on the entire score of the combination of
Yep.
both personality models.
Got it. That makes sense. So I can hear some SDRs and SDR leaders out there saying, well, our prospects don't have a digital footprint. So, our typical buyer doesn't.
Yeah.
So this, like the day you could spit out a DS to me, but what did you base that off of? Because I've been to their website and their LinkedIn or whatever online, and
Hmm.
there's not much there. So does there have to be data in order for this to be accurate, or can it be accurate with limited amounts of data?
Yeah, so a couple things there, which is a great question, by the way. Yeah, some ICPs are going to be a little trickier, right?
Mhm.
However, we resolve from LinkedIn, Twitter, or email. So even if we have email, we can resolve from there. Now, we resolve at a slightly lower resolution percentage,
Mm,
than like say LinkedIn or Twitter with email. But we're also going to give like a confidence score, right? Like, hey, with you, Tyler, we are 100% confident you're a DS, right?
so it was
Uh,
100% with my
yeah,
score
yeah, but
because
you're very active. You're
my
very
digital
active.
footprint is active, right?
Yeah, your
So
digital
that score
footprint
goes
is big.
it goes down based on the activity level almost online.
Based on the amount of data that we have to
Got
come
it.
to that conclusion. So, if you see that, it's a 60, 70% confidence level,
Mhm.
that's usually not enough to say definitively, I know this is the type, but it's
Yep.
probably close enough. But generally speaking, you know, 8 to 9 times out of 10, we're going to be 90% plus, confident in the score that we're giving based on that person. Now,
Mhm.
there's going to be some people that are, some particular ICPs that are a little bit trickier, but also, it just depends, because
Yep.
just because they're not posting as much as Tyler, doesn't mean that they don't have a digital footprint that they could have a digital footprint that you're not aware of.
Right, right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like obviously using a tool like Humantic would make this easy. But let's say you don't have a tool like Humantic, or that's something that your team can't afford. How can you implement some of these principles without a tool that makes it really easy to implement these
Yeah.
principles?
So I would say a good place to start is like there's a wealth of knowledge online,
Hmm.
podcast blogs, people posting on social that talk about disc selling generally, right? And disc selling is not some new novel concept. It's just that there's never really been great technology to
Yeah.
enable sellers to be able to pull that off. So people have mostly relied on reading people, right?
Mm.
So if
Yeah.
you based on your body language, your tone, the things that you say, I have to then process that and start to figure out what I think that you maybe might be. If you're practicing it quite regularly, then you can get good at it. A good place to start is really knowing yourself first. Like what is my type? What are the things that I tend to care most about? What are the things that drive me nuts? How what things come into play that would drive me to reply to a email if somebody was prospecting to me. So
Yep.
knowing yourself first is a really good place to start. And then just we have a ton of resources. There's tons of resources out there about disc. I would say the big place to start where a lot of people can just like start to really take a bite out of this
Hmm.
is knowing what things to avoid with each
Mm.
type, right? And so going back to a couple examples, with a
Just
D
those
type,
four. And when you say by each type, Colin, you just mean you're just simplifying it down to disc, not the 36 types, but just
yeah,
the four to start
yeah,
with.
yeah. You don't need to know every all 36 types and
Right,
variations
because that's just a
extremely
ton
well.
of things to keep up with. Oh, no, what which one
Yeah,
is he,
yeah.
Versus
We
4 is a little bit more manageable.
Yeah, we have a ton of resources on this stuff where we have like, hey, reasons that these particular prospects might be tough,
Mm,
what the winning strategy and magic lever, traps to avoid, landmines, things like that. So I would say the first thing to do is like really know yourself. Get familiar with some of the resources that are available out there, whether it's from Humantic or any other,
and
place that's
just
putting
Google, like,
things out.
disc selling
Yeah,
is kind
disc
of the
selling. Yeah,
is
yeah.
that the name that it's put on, or personality type selling or something like that?
Yeah, disc selling is a sales methodology that a lot of sales organizations use,
Yeah,
but typically they're having disc trainers coming in and enable
yep.
the team, and it's part of their culture. So after you kind of get a good sense of your own personal type, whether you run your profile in Humantic, whether you take one of those tests, maybe once or twice or a couple of times to feel happy with your results.
Yeah,
Whatever the case is, knowing yourself first is a really good place to start, and then just starting to understand what things you should avoid. What
yep.
things you should avoid is a really good place to start, because you'll start to see certain people and language that they use, and another great example that I like is like you hop on a Zoom call, and if you're with a D person, skip the pleasantries, like just get right into it.
Boom, yeah.
Okay. And now the opposite there is if you're with an I type, small talk, relationship building. And the funny thing is those things are really important to them.
Mm,
So sellers tend to default to whatever they are because they just, that's what they think is a winning strategy. And so the funny thing is you get on with an I type and you ask them how they've been, how their weekend was, or whatever the case is, and you just see them like light up like a Christmas tree, and you're like, wow, this stuff is actually really powerful. And if you're not a high I or score high in that particular quadrant as a seller, it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for you
mhm.
because from your perspective with your bias, you're going to think, man, if I was on the other side of the table, that would drive me nuts. Like, let's just get to the conversation. Let's get into it.
But you could
Um,
almost listen for that, right? I mean, you could prompt with a question initially, and then based off of that answer, that's probably a signal. Oh, this person's leaning D, this person's leaning I. And then I guess with an S and a C, I mean, I don't know, you might hear it, you might hear different things, right?
Yeah, yeah. So like with S types, you really don't want to be pushy. They're just typically slower paced people. So with them,
Yep.
if you're, really aggressive or pushy or try to create some false fake urgency, discounts to close it, like that stuff's just going to drive them away,
Mm,
and like with a C type, I said they're very detail oriented, right? So like really get, telling them a little bit more about how the sausage is made is recommended. And if you're the type that doesn't care how the sausage is made, just care how it tastes, that's going to feel weird for you. But
Yep.
with them, it's going to be the way to win them over.
100%. Colin, any parting words of advice for someone just trying to implement some of this selling methodology?
Yeah, I think if you're curious about this sort of stuff and you're wondering how do I get started, knowing yourself first, like I said, is a good
Yep.
place to start. Knowing some of these things to avoid, really just starting to put it into practice. Because, like we said, we've ran tons of pilots. We have teams that have had tons of success, and we've seen anywhere from range from 2 to 300% increase in positive reply for cold outbound, which everybody knows is extremely hard right now.
Mm,
And
yep.
so think about, whatever that means for you. How many more meetings would you book if that was the case? How much more pipeline would you generate? And so on.
Awesome. Well, Colin, thanks so much for the great conversation today. You can find Colin on LinkedIn, and we'll link to his LinkedIn profile and the Humantic website in our show notes. Those are going to be at our website at thesaleslift.com. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of Outbound Sales Lift. Make sure you hit subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and check out next week's episode filled with more great ideas on transforming your sales development efforts. For those listening in live, thanks so much for joining. And remember, no sales starts until you book that meeting.